Welcome to Stories of Brisco and Bradshaw. I would be Bradshaw. That would be your Chickashaw Dave, your Chickashaw Hall of Famer, Oklahoma's favorite son, Mr. Gerald Brisco. And we got a treat today. The six-pack, not like me and Mr. Brisco had, and not like the famous Brisco brothers car in Florida. The book from Brad Balukjian. And Brad, did I get it right?
You nailed it.
Guy got it right. Terrific author. He's done incredible history of the Sheik, Vince McMahon, but he went through the card of when the Sheik won the title and did background checks, did 15,000 miles going all over the world, tracking down these crazy old wrestlers. Incredible read, but we're glad to have him with us. Brad, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me, guys. Really appreciate it.
Hey, Brad, a good question for John is having spell your name. Just make sure he's got it
right. I just entered his name into my phone, and I literally had to go back like 3 times and look on the text to see what it was. No, not the text. I had a thing in the internet of his book to see what it was. I misspelled it 3 times.
You could buy all the vowels. You could buy all the vowels you want. You're still going to mess it up, probably.
Yeah, the only saving grace I had, one of my very best friends, one of my son's godfathers, Armenian. So when he told me that name, I knew exactly what he was talking about and knew how to spell it. Because like Kasijian was my buddy's name, and I had to learn how to spell that because he's my godfather's son. So I had to learn how to write it down on a piece of paper there. So when Brad introduced himself to me, I said I know what that is. I started Armenian. He said, yeah. So anyway, Brad, welcome aboard. It's taken us a while to get here through a couple of little hiccups that we've had here, but we finally got you on. You came down. I guess I met you during the pandemic or right after the pandemic when you came down to Florida to interview me through a mutual friend of John and I. That how we got it introduced was through Eric Bischoff. So Eric, you're a young man. Grew up in Providence, Rhode Island, middle-class family, upper middle-class family from the background there. And Providence, Rhode Island, and nothing middle-class about Providence. It's all upper middle-class out to me there. But anyway, you were one of 4 in your family that liked professional wrestling, and it got a little heat over. Kind of walk us through how you became a professional wrestling fan, and some of the Heat generation that being a fan kind of produced in your life.
Yeah, well, my first book was about baseball, and when I was growing up in Rhode Island, loving baseball and collecting cards, my dad.
Wax Pack, by the way, Wax Pack.
That's right.
Great book.
Thank you for the plug. My dad loved baseball. So like that classic father-son story, bonding over baseball, that was what I had with my dad. Then all of a sudden I come to my dad and I'm like, hey Dad, there's this great thing called wrestling on TV. And he was about ready to disown me because he said, that's fake. What are you watching that crap for? I mean, all the typical, no interest in that. And so it was the exact opposite. In fact, the dedication of this book I gave to my dad, and I said, thank you, Dad. Even though you hated wrestling, you still took me to the Providence Civic Center when I was 5 years old. And I was that little kid up in the nosebleed seats that was shrieking for the Iron Sheik, which was really weird in 1985 because nobody, it wasn't like when the heels are cool now, right? Back in 85, unless you were like a Roddy Piper type,
in 85, it was USA.
Yeah. So, I mean, I was alone up there, people getting a lot of funny looks, and but I liked the Iron Sheik, but I was always somebody that didn't follow the crowd and always kind of was, interested in the thing that other people weren't. So, yeah, like so many kids in the 80s, I grew up with the Saturday night's main event, Saturday morning wrestling. I mean, it was the Northeast, right? So it was a lot of WWF stuff and that whole Hulkamania generation.
And that great arena there, I don't know what it is named now, the old Dunkin' Donuts arena. It may still be that now, but we've been there a million freaking times there. Timmy White had his bar there, the Friendly Tap, and outside of the Providence. It was such a cool place to go up to, and all the history of the unions and guys that would come around, little mafia ties in, and it was pretty cool.
Funny story about that. And it's in the book, but I can elaborate on it. So when I was doing research, I found a guy named Mike Breen. You guys remember that name at all?
No.
Mike Breen was a referee that got hired by the WWF in about 83. And he came on with Tim White. They both came on together because Tim White had gone to college with Ed Cohen, who was the arena booker. And, Timmy was a young guy. This guy, Mike was a hockey player, minor league hockey player, who actually played for the Cape Cod Buccaneers, which was Vince McMahon Jr.'s hockey team in 1981-82 in out there in the Cape Cod Coliseum out in Hyannis. And Vince didn't own the building. He had a lease on the building and he needed to cover his costs. So he found a minor league hockey team that would give him a guaranteed 40 dates a year. And he brought in Jim Troy, who was another hockey player, to be to play on the team, to be the player coach. So Jim Troy and Mike Breen are players on the team. The league lasts 1 year because Vince may be a lot of things, but he is not a great hockey promoter. And the team folds, and now Vince this is about 1982, and he turns to Jim Troy. He says, "What do you think about wrestling?" And he turns to Mike Breen and says, "What do you think about wrestling?" At this time, the company is like Vince, Linda, Howard Finkel, Ed Cohen, maybe six people. And his dad, of course. And he had just bought it in June of 82 from his dad. And so he convinces Jim Troy to be his executive vice president of Titan Sports. And then this is a story that gets lost in all the history books and the documentaries. It's that Jim Troy is like his right-hand man for a good 2 or 3 years. He's the guy going out there across the country in 83, 84, along with Joe Perkins, who's an old syndication guy, going into all the markets and trying to convince the local TV station managers to put WWF on the air. And then Jim is also the guy that gets tasked with the overseas tours to the Middle East in 83, 84, which was just an absolute shit show. And there's a whole section in the book about what happened there. But back to my story. So Mike Breen ends up as working for Vince, also selling merchandise, being a referee. And he didn't like Timmy White loved the business and Mike didn't like it. And so he decided to leave, and he came to Vince a couple years later and he said, "Hey, Vince, Tim and I want to start a bar called Friendly Tap, but we don't have the money." And I guess Vince, he's like, "It's kind of a lot of money." And I guess Vince goes, "Well, in that classic Vince, well, what's a lot of money?" he's like, I think it was like $100 grand or 50 grand. It wasn't, 30 grand. And Vince goes, "That's not a lot of money," and takes out his checkbook and signs a check for those guys to open the Friendly Tap. And
wow.
And then they went on, as you probably went to that bar for years. That was their bar.
Well, that JBL refurbished it at least half a dozen times.
I sure did. Oh my God, that was so great. Me and Ron did our bar fight scenes there. And, Timmy went from nanotube televisions to flat screens, HD. He went from a jukebox that didn't play to be like a digital jukebox. Vince got the bill. He goes, "I didn't know I'm buying Timmy White a new bar." Yeah. So Mike was his partner. Was he his partner for years?
Those guys ran it together. Mike is like the town's public works kind of ground supervisor for a town.
I must have met Mike. I just don't remember the name. I met Timmy's partners. I met all his buddies, and Arnie Scollin always hung out with him. But so I've been there a bunch of times.
Yeah, you probably did. Yeah, he's got pictures with all the boys over the years.
Yeah, we would show up. He had pictures of me and Ron in the very front, and Andre would be in the back. And I go, "Timmy, no one believes this. No one, no one. Anybody who was coming, Timmy would take their picture and put it in the very front, like the foyer, to make you feel special. And he would take Andre's down, and you could tell what he had done because he took Andre's and put it where your picture was, like back by the bathroom. And we're like, "Timmy, there's no way that you leaving Andre's photo back here by the bathroom."
Well, so interesting though is like when they started, Mike said Timmy really he wasn't that into it. He was, they were setting up like tables at high school gyms in front of 500 people selling the very beginnings of merchandise before Vince really blew it up. And then Timmy got the bug and Mike didn't. And he told me Vince came to him and said, you don't like this business? And he was like, "I'm sorry, Vince. Like after Jimmy Snuka tried to claw my eyes out at 30,000 feet over the Atlantic, I think I'm done."
Funny how that happens. Hey, I want to talk to you about Jimmy Snuka. I want to hear this, but I also want to hear the hockey team, because it's so interesting about Vince. Vince, people ask one of his greatest traits, and Jerry knows him better than I do, But one of the traits I always thought that he had was his ego was not in whatever he was doing. You know, it was in the success. So if he had a project that didn't work, like the XFL, like the World Bodybuilding Federation, some CEOs would do that forever because their ego wouldn't do them. Vince would just, hey, it's day one, doesn't not working, we'll cut it. And he would cut things off right away. It's a very unique trait of a CEO that he would allow stuff to fail and just go on because his ego was not so big in himself that he had to carry something on because he thought, oh, this looks bad if I fail.
His motto in that, John, was always cut your losses now, cut them now. You know, he didn't like to carry things out, man. If he saw it was gonna, because I found that out running town for him, man. If we fell behind a certain quota and advanced ticket sales, cut your losses, cut them now, cancel the town. So that's how he was. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think he looked at hockey as a way to pay the bills. It wasn't working. He didn't have so much pride that he was going to double down, right? He would say, yeah, that's a failed venture. I can face that reality and move on.
So these guys had Vince McMahon as the owner of a hockey team.
Yeah.
That's cool.
and the hockey team. Tell us a little bit more about this. I think it's interesting. The whole Cape Cod of Vince McMahon was very interesting to me. I think it's where he learned the business.
I mean, that like if someone could really dig into that 1979 to 83 period that's never really talked about, right? That there's that time that in Vince's life that doesn't get a lot of coverage where he's out there on the Cape and he's running some towns. You know, his dad is still owning the company. Jim Troy, the guy that was there with him, has stories about Vince locking himself in this very simple cinder block office with the yellow legal pads and just writing everything down, right? Just constant note taking. And I think Linda's often underrated in the success of business because of what she did in the expansion in those early years of really dotting the I's and crossing the T's on the contracts, the business operations. You know, she had her paralegal background, and I don't think Vince could have done it without Linda's, what she did from a really operational perspective. And then, Jim Troy was a party guy. He was, those guys ran fast and hard, him and Vince. I'm sure they hadn't told many of the stories, can't tell the stories from those years, but I know that Jim was like the assistant coach / player. So if you ever seen the movie Slapshot with Paul Newman, Jim Troy was kind of like that kind of character, and Mike Breen was the enforcer. He was the fighter. So the thing is, when he got into the fight with Snuka on the airplane, like the original plane ride from hell, Mike Breen could hold his own because he was a hockey fighter, even though he wasn't a big guy. He could really scrap. And, I think Jimmy Snuka was shocked this guy was just, fighting back hard.
Brad, take us to that because, we've all heard the story of Jim Troy's fights and, with talent on the road and internationally, but I've never heard of Snuka's fight with that. Can you kind of walk us through what happened there? Because this is really new to me.
So the one of the untold stories of the WWS expansion in 83, 84 is, if you look at it from a pure business perspective, right? They had a lot of increasing costs because he's raiding all the talent and he's upping his production values and he's bringing in Nelson Sweglar to run his TV production studio and all these people he's bringing in. And so he has to have, revenue to offset the costs, right? And he's expanding, he's running more towns, he's building merchandising. But one of the things that no one talks about is Vince was thinking internationally really early on. So he says, I'm going to run tours in the Middle East because I can make a shit ton of money by booking in the Middle East. And this is early. This is like, now we have all the Saudi Arabia shows. But back in 83, he was going to Kuwait. 84, he went to Bahrain, Qatar, Oman, United Arab Emirates, and Dubai. He was looking to do shows in Africa in 84. He was looking to do shows in New Zealand. He went to Australia in 85. So like this is that international component brought in a lot of revenue at a time when he needed revenue, right? And then Jared, he's buying companies. He needs to pay the promoters that he's buying these promotions of. So he says to Jim Troy, I want you to not only handle the expansion of syndication and closed circuit, but I want you to run the international tour. I mean, Vince is smart. He's like, I'm not going to go over, you deal with going over there. So now Jim Troy is having to negotiate deals with princes in Kuwait and all these international tycoons. And to get the audience ready for their programming, he has his TV shows translated into Arabic and dubbed into Arabic and starts sending it over to the Middle East to broadcast the shows. Because think about it, in Dubai, the only thing on TV is like the state television, right? There's no options. But now you put wrestling, and they've never seen wrestling. There's no such thing as pro wrestling in the Middle East at that time. So he's exposing them to the audience so that when he sends a tour over there, these guys are red hot for the matches. So it's brilliant marketing. So he does like 4 tours in 83, 84, 85. And one of the early ones, they go over there and Jimmy Snuka's on the tour. I think he's working with Don Morocco. Mike Breen is the referee for a lot of the tour. And they're at the bar at the International Hotel in Dubai. And Sika, the Wild Samoan, is literally throwing beer bottles up in the air and then just watching them smash on the floor because he's just so drunk and doing whatever, right? So Jim is trying to literally put Sika on a luggage cart to roll him to the room. And when they get upstairs, Sika wakes up and he suddenly comes to and he barges into someone's hotel room, right into a couple that are in their room. So imagine being this couple and you got out of nowhere, Sika the Wild Samoan and Jim Troy tumbling into your hotel room, just drunk off his ass, right? So that's what Jim's dealing with on this tour. Now, down in the lobby, Jimmy Snuka is hitting on some woman, and clearly the woman is not liking it, right? So Mike Breen goes over and tries to kind of run interference and kind of get him away from her. And Jimmy Snuka does not like that, so he just kind of shoots him a look. So then fast forward, they're flying back to the U.S. through London, and they're on the first leg of the flight, and Mike Breen is sitting with Tim White on the flight, and Jimmy Snuka comes over, and he's just got rage in his eyes, and he starts first he starts throwing like quarters at them, like pelting them with stuff, until finally he just comes over, and he goes, "You guys are office rats, you guys are snitches," just starts going off on that, and then just hits Mike Breen with, like, I don't know if he slapped him or hit him, but these two guys start going at it and this is a commercial flight, right? In the aisles, they're tumbling back and they're going all the way to the back, and I guess Snuka picks him up, throws him through the bathroom door, and Mike said he came to, and he's lying next to the silver toilet, and Snuka's trying to pull his eye out. Like, that's what he's going for his eye, and so he bit his finger, and then John Morocco jumps in, the Tonga Kid jumps in. So then at one point, Mike said he's bashing the Tonga Kid against the side of the plane, and he realizes it's the emergency exit door, which is not a good idea. So the whole thing, they finally calm it down. And then at some point, the pilot actually was so bad, the pilot came out and said, "When I land this plane in London, like, you guys are under arrest." And then he said Jim Troy, who was the agent or the promoter, disappeared with the captain up in the top of the little corkscrew in the plane with a bag of Kuwaiti dinars, which is currency. And then
that'll work every time.
The problem was solved. Yeah.
It's amazing, and Jerry knows this better than I do, how much was brushed under like that. Now, I'm not talking about, crimes against, but I'm talking about that was a crime, but I'm talking about fights and things like that. I mean, just stupid stuff that guys shouldn't be doing. It was brushed under by a little bit of payola, a little bit of glad handing. There was a lot of things done that were taken care of back then.
Same thing happened to us going from the U.S. to Germany. We were landing in London.
I was on the plane.
He was when British Bulldog. We got.
There was a knife stuck in the wall in the first class cabin. Yeah,
exactly. And so the pilot got me, and I had to do the same thing. I just produced some something that would calm him down, because he said we're getting on the plane,
Yeah.
and from London to Germany. And I said, we got to, not on this plane, you know. So I went. And got the money. I think I got the money from Timmy White, you know.
Yeah.
And Timmy,
Tim,
because we
Tim
always
White is,
had a bag. We always carried a bag of cash. So when we got there, guys needed cash, money, so we could distribute a little bit of spending money for the guys, you know, like a draw. And so I used that draw money to kind of calm the captain down. Here you go, Captain. Well, I promise you nothing. And David Moore threatened to quit there in London because he was home. He was in England. He was home already. So I'll just quit. I'll go home. I said, when you go home, you might as well stay there because you won't come back. So I talked him back on the plane, and then we flew on to Germany. So those things, like John said, a lot of that stuff was just swept under the floor, and nobody knows until now. You know,
Right. That first class cabin, the whole plane looked like a tornado had come through there. I mean, there was stuff everywhere. It started with a food fight, and then somebody threw a knife, and the knife stuck in the wall of the plane. It wasn't like a sharp knife. It was a knife you had, with your catering. But back then they were, steel knives. So and then knife sticks in the wall. That all hell had broken loose. I was just certain they're going to take every one of us to jail, and thankfully, Mr. Brisco found a captain that needed a little cash.
We all need a little cash.
Little petty cash goes a long way, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
but what crazy times though. People forget about those 83 to 85. And there was a lot of international incidents during that time as well. That involved quite a few people. Timmy White boxed with Marvin Hagler. He was a pretty salty guy too. Yeah, he threw hands really well. He didn't box him. Now it was a exhibition, win some rounds. It was sparred with him. More importantly,
I didn't know that.
Yeah, Timmy was a tough guy like Mike, just a real old salty guy. And Timmy was the guy that would take care of us. You can ask Mr. Brisco. He was one of the most valuable guys in the company because you couldn't steal from us. Because Timmy would settle up with cash, and he was so used to dealing with those guys, those crooks in Rhode Island. He knew how to not get stolen from. So Vince would send him out when they counted the money, and you couldn't fool him. You couldn't fool him and Arnie. Timmy's one of the most important guys in the company because he took care of Vince.
Right.
He did.
Well, that's I think that's Vince obviously incredibly successful in what he did in his business. But I think one of the things that I got from the book and talking to a lot of people in the office is Vince was smart enough to surround himself with a lot of really competent people in areas that he didn't have a lot of expertise. Right. So he knew he had to improve his TV production values, but Vince was not an actual TV production guy. So he brought in, Nelson Sweglar and that team. He knew
Nelson was fantastic. Nelson's an old name that kind of gets swept under the cover, as is Joe Perkins. Without Joe Perkins and his syndication, I don't think Vince could have ever been as big as he was, because even though he was trying to get national cable TV and all that, cable was in the beginnings, stages of its birth, so it was hard to get. But Perkins, he was a syndicator. He could get TV stations at anywhere Vince wanted. Hey, this is my target. Give me a station. And so Joe was invaluable on that aspect. Vince was very intelligent when he started at him and Linda, especially having Linda along, because like you said, without Linda, I doubt if a lot of the business aspects of the business would have got carried out there. But Joe Perkins was really valuable there. But take us there, and how you started going after your youth days. Your dad would take you up in the balcony. How did you finally decide, I want to meet Iron Sheik? How did you meet Iron Sheik? And take us through that process.
Yeah. So by the time I was in college, Iron Sheik was kind of towards the end of his run, end of his career. It's the late 90s. He's overweight and he's older. He was one of the oldest WWF champions ever. I think he was 42 when he became champion. So much later than most guys. And he was already struggling with the addiction and all of that. So he was wrestling in front of small crowds, indie shows. And I was always a pretty determined, resourceful kid and training journalist in training. So I basically discovered who his agent was and developed a relationship helping his agent with stuff until the Sheik was coming to a show in New Jersey. And I said, hey, can I come down and help out and meet the Sheik? And he said, sure. And so I go down there. This is about 2001, and I'm only 20 years old. And I met up with Khosrow, his real name, Khosrow Vaziri. And I just kind of, I guess, like I said, he took a liking to me because I think I knew so much about his career. You know, I really had done all the research, and I knew about all his stuff outside of pro wrestling, that he won the, 1971 AAU's, gold medal and all his stuff before turning pro. And I think he appreciated that. So that first night I got a lesson in the wrestling lifestyle pretty quick, because first time I meet him, I ended up, driving him to a diner at 4 a.m. because he's high out of his mind and demanding food. And so I remember we were in my 93 Ford Escort, and I'm like starstruck, right? Because this is the Iron Sheik. And now I'm like driving him and he has the munchies. And he brings a stack of 8x10 photos of himself with a Sharpie. And I'm like, what the hell is that for? We go to this diner. It's really just the two of us. And he's like, Brad, Bubba, order whatever you want. So, okay. So I, get some food. And sure enough, this group of like 5 or 6 drunk college kids stumble in, and they recognize him. And then it's like, oh, leave this message for my friend on their cell phone. And he like on cue brings out the photos and the Sharpies, and he's signing everything and giving everything out. So we finish up. Their kids are all happy. And then he's like, all right, watch this. And he walks us over. He goes, Iron Sheik, take care of you. Now you take care of the legend, the Iron Sheik. And he puts the bill on their table. And we walk out. And so my only dine and dash in my life is with the Iron Sheik. But then we kept in touch, and I became a writer. A couple of years later, I actually left my job at a magazine to go live next to him out in Fayetteville, Georgia, about where Paul Orndorff lived, back in 2005. And it was supposed to be like the biography of the Iron Sheik. And you'll see from this book, The Six Pack, the first chapter of the book is set in 2005, and I recount what happened. And the first line of the book is, the Iron Sheik just threatened to kill me.
Yeah. But he gave you your choice on how you wanted to die.
Yeah, it was very considerate of him, right?
Yeah. Hey, Brad, how do you want to die? I can either
so what were the choices? Did he give you different choices, or he just will ask you how you want to die?
Yeah, no, in fact, I'll read you the line right here. I have the book. The first choice was, I'll shoot you with my .38 Magnum, stab you with my Bowie knife, or just break your fucking leg.
Wait a minute. Breaking your leg won't kill you, though, will it?
That's true. And that's why I was like turning it over in my head. Like, I think I'm going to go with C. Having my leg broken.
Because A is out of the question. A 38, you're dead. A Bowie knife might make it. Broken leg, you're probably going to live.
Speaking of breaking legs, I want to bring up, we all know the story of how Vern called him to offer him $100,000 to break Hogan's leg, right? When he was going to drop the belt. So I asked him about that, and people have asked me, do they think is it a shoot? Did that really happen? And I said, I think it happened because of what Sergeant Slaughter, Bob Remus, has said, which is that, so Bob independently confirmed that in Pittsburgh, a couple days before the show where Sheik dropped the belt to Hogan, Sheik knocked on his door and asked him, what should I do? And I trust, Bob Remus's word on that. And I think that also the story, Bob and the Sheik have always told the story consistently the same way over the years, which is always a good sign that if someone's telling the truth, the story never changes, So what's funny about that is, obviously he didn't break Hogan's leg and he turned Vern down, but in his calculus about whether to do it or not, nowhere was the idea of like actually committing a major crime in front of 23,000 people and like literally maiming somebody. It was more like, well, I'm going to make more in money on the house show circuit after, if I don't break his leg. So I think we're good.
Yeah. So you had a quote in there also about you and Bob Remus. Bob wasn't cooperating. What was your conflict with Bob in the beginning?
Well, the thing about Bob, so So the premise of the book is to find the guys that were there the night the Sheik won the belt, right? And I knew based on my baseball book that probably not all the guys are going to talk to me. I mean, sometimes someone just doesn't want to talk or whatever reason. And so it ended up that Bob was the guy in this book that wouldn't talk to me. And I was kind of confused at first about, why that was. And then I realized, well, I think what it is that at that time, Bob had not yet come out and admitted that his whole Vietnam thing was work. And he was still publicly saying, I served in the military and I was in Vietnam and all of that, and kind of playing the kayfabe character. And he probably knew that I would ask about that because the book is about like who these people are in real life and kind of the tension between their character and their real personality. And so I imagine that was fine. I didn't get to talk to him, but I still went to Eden Prairie where he grew up and found his high school football coach and met his high school classmates and was still able to kind of tell the story of his life.
Brad, that's one of the good things about when we do our podcast, because we interview guys, that are, were big stars in the 70s and 80s and some of the 90s, you get a few 2000s, but a lot of the statute of limitations has run out.
Yeah.
And so we can ask about, they're no longer in character about anything, like Sarge is protecting something that was a kayfabe part of his character. That's an issue you have when you're talking to somebody. Of course, I don't think anybody kayfabes today, but that back then, especially because so many things were still kept, hidden from public.
Right.
That's why we love our podcast now, because we talk to these guys and, they've been retired forever. So they don't mind telling the story now.
Sure. Yeah.
And, one thing back with Sheik and Vern, for those that weren't listening, because this is such a great story, and so many people have heard Sheik, I break your leg, I break your back, and all the, especially his greatest Twitter in the world was the Sheik's. But tell us the story about what happened, at least that you think happened, as far as you can tell, between Vern and Sheik wanting to break Hogan's leg.
Right. So the thing is, let's back up to 1972 when Khosrow Vaziri, he's been in the country less than 3 years. He came here speaking no English, right? He defected he really was from Iran. He had a whole backstory in Iran. He really, the irony is that there's been no more patriotic person for the U.S. than the Iron Sheik, because he was really disappointed and disgusted with Iran after what happened to his friend over there. It's a whole other story. But he comes to the U.S. and he is an amateur star. But obviously, as he would always famously say, he's like, in the United States, you can't eat your gold medal, right? And basically how in Iran, you got taken care of financially for wrestling for the country. But in the U.S., you're not going to get paid for that. So he begged he begged his coach, Alan Rice, to take him to Vern.
Alan Rice is a dear friend of mine. Go into it, as you're telling this story, kind of inclined Alan Rice in it, because Alan was a patriot deluxe and a great amateur wrestling supporter. So kind of tie Alan in with this segment we're going through.
Sure. So Alan is a huge part of the Iron Sheik story, because when the Sheik came to the U.S. in 1969, speaking no English, the only thing he knew in English was Alan Rice's name, because he had met him at an international competition, and Alan had said, if you're ever in the U.S., look me up. So Khosrow Vaziri, the Iron Sheik, gets on a one-way flight to Minneapolis, is literally wandering the terminal, going up to people saying, Alan Rice, until, Minneapolis, Midwesterners are nice people. Someone recognizes the name and calls him up and says, hey, Alan, there's this crazy Iranian wandering around saying your name. And so Alan puts him in a cab and brings him to his house, lets him stay in his house, and then puts him up in his old fraternity at the University of Minnesota, and really takes him in, right? And then has him help ultimately coaches the U.S. 1972 U.S. Olympic team with him. So, Alan was this conduit between the amateurs and the pros, and Vern loved the guys that were amateur wrestlers. And so when there was a new training class in 1972, Alan convinced Vern to let Kaz in that class, along with Ric Flair and Bob Ruggers and Jim Brunzell and Ken Patera and Brad Gagne. And that's when Kaz first trains to be
what a Hall of Fame training class that was. right? No,
Yeah.
Yeah. And actually, and then Bob Remus was in the class the next year in '73.
So, Brad, I'm sorry. I want to chase another rabbit right quick before we go further. Khosrow, he got on a plane to Minneapolis. How did he get on the plane? How did he defect from Iran?
Well, so his dream as a kid was to be the greatest amateur wrestling star in Iran. And in the 50s and 60s, wrestling was one of the biggest sports in Iran. There was a guy named Gholam Reza Takhti, who was like the LeBron James of Iran back then. I mean, even now,
he was the Alexander Curly of those
yeah,
years.
that's much better, Jerry. That much better analogy. And to this day, there's pictures of Takhti in in cafes in Tehran. I mean, he's a folk hero forever because not only was he a gold medalist in the Olympics, he was like he protested the Shah's dictatorship. You know, he was a man of the people. He would speak up against the Shah, and he was also he was kind of Khosrow Vaziri's hero. He was about 10 years older than him, and Kaz always wanted to be the next Takhti. So in 1968, Takhti shows up dead in a bathtub in the hotel. And this causes outrage. I mean, people filling the streets and protesting because officially it's ruled a suicide, but no one believes that they thought that the Shah's secret police had killed him. And so after that happened, Kaz always said that, his heart was broken by that. And that's why he left Iran and only went back one time all those years after 1969.
Now, was he allowed to leave? I mean, it was a matter where he's like wanting to immigrate to the United States.
So this is 10 years before the Iranian Revolution. So it's still, Iran is still, open to leaving. You could come and go.
Right.
So yeah, he was able to.
So he just gets a one-way ticket to Minneapolis, and he has no plan.
No plan.
Except to walk around the airport and look for Alan.
Wow. Alan Rice.
That's it.
That's one of the dumbest things I've ever heard. I love it. I mean, I love the
and it works.
I love the audacity of I'm going to America. I'm gonna make a name for myself, and I'm gonna meet up this guy that I know. And you
Mr. Alan Rice.
That's right. You fly one way and walk around the airport asking for the guy until somebody finds him. That's insane. That is so chic.
Yeah. In that chapter about the Sheik, where I focus on the match with Backlund, I tell all that back. I even get into the history of the relationship between Iran and the United States, because there's all of these complexities, right? That in '83, it was just good guy, US Hulk Hogan, USA, bad guy, Iron Sheik, Iran. But when you get into it, again, there's no more American story than the Iron Sheik, like you just said, John, coming here.
Oh my God, yeah. It's
and
awesome.
making it,
Go with the American dream.
Yeah.
So, okay, I'm a mark. I admit it. Sheik, bodyguard, Shah of Iran. Was any bit of that true?
True. So there was so he was in the Iranian military, and he was on the national wrestling team. So when in the '60s, you got to remember, Iran and the U.S. were really close allies. They had we supplied a lot of the weaponry for the Shah, and when dignitaries would come visit, like Kennedy or any other people come in, the Shah needed a whole army of bodyguards to protect him and his wife, often his wife, and Kaz was one of the bodyguards for his wife. Yeah.
Wow. It's just one of the greatest characters in wrestling history is the Sheik.
Well, because it's true, right? I mean, the fact that his character is a shoot.
And that's right. So I'll tell you a quick story, which I've told a million times. Mr. Briscoe's heard it all a million times. Sheik thought my name was Brad Shaw. Two names. So one time I were in Oklahoma and I'm bored, and so I'm driving around and I've got Polaroid.
Wait a minute. How can you be bored in Oklahoma?
Because it's Oklahoma. And so Barry Windham's got a Polaroid camera, way before cell phones, and he's taking a picture of me taking a leak on Briscoe's hometown and his working hometown, Stillwater and Blackwell. So I'm sitting there in the middle of country road. There's a city limit sign, and I'm taking a leak, and Barry Windham is behind me taking a Polaroid picture, so you can see I'm going to put it up in catering the next day. So to get at Mr. Briscoe. So Sheik comes by with Rikishi. They're on this road out in the middle of nowhere. It's not dirt. It's a little paved road, but it's the middle of nowhere. This little sign. And Sheik stops And he looks at me, and I look around and go, my God, it's the Sheik and Rikishi. So he goes, Brad. And I said, yes, Mr. Sheik. He goes, Mr. Shaw, is everything okay? And I said, well, yeah, Sheik, I'm just taking a leak on Briscoe's hometown. And he goes, oh, Brad, you are such a fine boy. And he drove off. He drove off. He met my dad one time. He goes, Mr. Shaw, your boy Brad, such a fine young man. It's just my dad had no idea.
John, or should I say Mr. Shaw, I hope one day at a fan event, someone brings that Polaroid up and asks you to sign.
I wish I still had them. Yeah, I think the whole thing turned into a disaster. It's not, the topic we're talking about. But when I sat up there in catering and waiting for Jerry to come in, because he had stretched me a million times already. I know what he's going to do to me. Well, his brother, Jack, comes in with Danny Hodge.
Oh, yeah.
And I've got all these photos up in catering at the very front, and I'm waiting for Jerry, and I look up there and go, oh, my God, this is the worst day of my life. And I just looked at it, and there's no back entrance. Jack's sitting there looking at those pictures, and every one of them looks at me, and I get stooged by all the boys. Yeah. Hodge stretched me so bad, I couldn't lift a bench press for about 2 months.
No.
He got my elbow. He had my elbow.
Hodge walked over and gives him one of those handshakes, he grabs his hand, starts. At the same time, he's got his elbow, and he's squeezing both his hand and his elbow at the same time.
And the whole time he's going, so you think you're funny? No, sir, I don't. I'm trying to apologize. I've really tried hard to apologize to you and to Mr. Briscoe, both of them.
I think Cod's like Sheik. He got in the later years all the Twitter craziness, but I think like at his core, he always had such love and respect for the guys early in his career that he learned the business from, like all the shooters, right? He loved Danny Hodge. He loved telling stories about those guys. Because I think like there's the pro side of the Sheik, and then there's the amateur side. And I think he always took as much pride in the amateur side.
He was a super nice guy. There wasn't a mean bone in Sheik's body. I mean, he was just a nice guy. So tell me how it got to, for those that are listening that don't know the story, what happened, what Vern wanted from a broken leg.
Oh, right. Sorry. I forgot.
You're getting to it.
Yeah. So
it's me and Jerry's fault. We're the ones chasing rabbits because we're so interested in what you're saying.
So what happened is so Vern, is responsible for Sheik's big break, right? He gets him in the business. And then actually in 1976, Sheik wasn't getting over as a babyface named Khosrow Vaziri. So he asked Vern if he could turn heel. And it was actually Vern's wife who gave him the name Iron Sheik and said, why don't you shave your head and grow the mustache and all that. And meanwhile, poor Khos's wife, Carol, had just married him a year earlier. And, he's this handsome, ripped, 190-pound, dark-haired guy. And now all of a sudden, a year into the marriage, he's like, oh, I'm going to shave my head and grow a crazy mustache and, make myself as ugly as possible. So I think, that was some sacrifice for Carol, who still, was with him to the day he died. And so Khos always had a lot of allegiance and love for Vern Gagne because he brought him in and helped make him a star. And so when Terry Bollea, Hulk Hogan, comes in 83 and the Sheik is the champion and pretty clear that Terry's going to get the belt, Vern calls Iron Sheik and says, hey, in the match, break Hogan's leg for real, take the belt to Minnesota, and let's screw over this whole WWF expansion thing. And and Khos gave it some thought. Like I said, he went to Bob Remus, Sergeant Slaughter, who he was one of his closest friends and confidants, and asked what he should do. And ultimately, and Bob gave him the good advice, which was, Khos, you'll make a lot more money if you stick around here and do the job. And he was right.
So the only reason he didn't break Hogan's leg was because he makes more money not breaking it.
Right. Like I said, it had nothing to do with committing crimes or the ethics of it. It was just a financial decision, right?
It's not like, hey, I can commit a felony here or I don't. That doesn't really matter.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Or you can look at it.
How do I get booked after?
Or you could look at it the other way, John, where Sergeant Slaughter actually helped create Hulkamania.
Yeah, that's right.
True. That's true. If Sergeant given Sheik some really bad advice, that would You talk about changing the business.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
You know,
What a
because one thing
trajectory.
about it, I mean, one thing about it, you're not 100% sure he could do it, right? I mean, Hogan was a fairly tough guy. He wasn't a shooter,
And,
but
and a big guy too.
he was a huge guy. He was strong, and Hogan was tough. You know, he was trained by
Yeah.
Hiro Matsuda. You know, not a shooter like Sheik, but you know, Hogan could hold his own. I mean, that would have been pretty interesting.
John, did
like
you ever
Brad,
go ahead,
Brad. Like Brad's going to bring up a little bit Hogan's background. Where Hogan grew up. I mean, it was the docks at Tampa. I mean, it was that at that time when Hogan was growing up. I mean, it was. I mean, you can imagine the docks. It's anywhere in the world where you go around the docks. It's not the millionaires, full little rotten kids running around. It's a bunch of tough little fighting kids running around the neighborhood. That's the environment that Hogan grew up in Fort Tampa.
Yeah, and trained by Hiro. You know, he wrestled some really good matches in Japan. He just didn't have to wrestle as Hogan. He did. He was the Hulkamaniac. You know, he got over doing that
with Hogan, John.
What? Excuse me.
Did you ever work with Hogan?
I did. Yeah. One of in Philadelphia, I was the champion, and
he had to call all of his fraternity brothers too and tell them I'm working.
I did. I called every one of them. That's the only time I've ever done that. And Hogan came in. I was so honored to work with him because good grief, man. I paid the pay-per-view when he slammed the Giant. You know, when I was in college, and I was such a big fan. And I said, what would you like to do? And he goes, "You're the champ." And I thought, my life is fulfilled. Hogan just called me champ. I said, I can go now. I can go.
So was that in like 2002 when he came back?
No, it had to be 04 because it was a dark match in Philadelphia. I believe it was what it was.
And it just one-on-one?
No, it was no, I think it was there were other people in it, I believe.
Okay. Yeah. Oh, that's great. Yeah.
Yeah, it was not a 1-on-1. I may have even been a 6-man, but it was so cool because they said, "Who wants to do the job?" And I said, "I do." I said, "I want to put Hogan over in Philadelphia. It's the greatest honor. That's the greatest thing ever."
That's awesome.
And he tatered me with a leg drop and bloodied my nose. And Finley was making fun of me. He goes, he's got a fake knee. He bloodied your nose with a fake knee. Just making fun of me. I don't care. It's Hogan. I don't care.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was great. People have such different impressions of Hogan. I thought he was terrific. I brought a group of kids. I know we're chasing rabbits again. I brought a group of kids from Bermuda one time, and they took them to NXT when they were filming some show that Hogan was on, a TV show they were filming NXT, and Hogan had a bad back. Hogan is the only one that got it from that table, and by far he's 10 times more famous than everybody else was at that table. And he hobbled over on a cane and took pictures with all those kids.
Yeah.
He's just, I think I have a lot of respect for Hogan.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, that was, one of the themes in the book is like I said earlier, kind of like the line between the character and the real person, right? And I was trying to get at that in the different chapters. And one of the interesting things, so for years there was all that internet heat between Hogan and Sheik, right? And they're playing the whole thing. And you mentioned Sheik's Twitter account and all that. So at the end of the book, I go back to Georgia and I'm meeting with the Sheik again, 17 years after that death threat. Now I'm back in his living room and it's great to catch, he's sober, which I'm really glad that he had a sort of happy ending in the end. And we're having a nice conversation, chatting about everything. And I put this in the book that while we're sitting there on Twitter, the Iron Sheik, and people can't see I'm using air quotes, the Iron Sheik on Twitter is saying like, go F yourself, I'll make you humble and all that. And it's like, of course, it never was the Iron Sheik on Twitter. It was his people, his handlers, doing that to play a character. And while that's happening, I said to him, I was like, do you really not like Terry Bollea? And he's like, no, it's fine. Like, he's not my best friend, but there's no actual heat there. So it's just funny how the wrestling internet culture and all that, it gets so carried away. And in reality, Hulk and Iron Sheik were on good terms.
Were they on good terms? I never knew that. I never knew if they were or weren't. So I'm sorry, I'm saying, were they on good terms? Because I never knew if they were.
I mean, they weren't sending Christmas cards, but they weren't. There was no like bad blood, really.
Yeah.
Well, and on a smaller smaller token, Brian Blair and Sheik. I mean, I had them both in Waterloo, Iowa on the same weekend. Everybody, oh man, that's going to be great. Well, you got Blair and Sheik there. I mean, Sheik was so glad to see Blair and vice versa. I mean, this Sheik was a great worker. I mean, he convinced everybody to eat with Hogan. He convinced everybody to eat with Blair. I mean, Sheik loved everybody for it. I could tell.
Yeah, I think that, and then of course, like there was a period there where he was just in a really dark place with the drugs. And
right. Yeah.
And
Exactly.
I felt bad because that in that time, I think a lot of people were exploiting him, and he was that character he was getting a lot of attention for that, so he was just kind of rolling with it. But I think what I like to see in the end of his story was that the guy that I saw in 2022, which ended up being less than a year before he passed away, was back to being the Khosrow Vaziri that the real person underneath.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on to get back to the book here. How did you decide all of a sudden, I want to find out what these guys are going to? I'm going to go to a training school in New Jersey and kind of figure this out. That's insane. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I always felt like I tell people, like, I'm not a wrestling journalist. I'm not a wrestling writer. I'm a writer that is interested in wrestling and finds the whole culture very interesting. And I've always had a lot of respect for the people that do it. You guys, the wrestlers, and I always felt like if I'm going to write about this and try to do it justice, I need to know what it actually feels like to go in a ring and take a bump and to hit the ropes and do it myself. So yeah, there's a chapter in there where I tell the history of pro wrestling, like where did this thing come from, how did it evolve from catch as catch can and amateur style and all these different predecessors, and then I go in and do a day of training camp when I talk about just how hard it is. I mean, I took a video of me running the ropes and I watched it back later, and I was like, this looks like I'm in slow motion, but in the moment, every time I hit the rope, I was like, oh God, this hurts.
Wow.
This is steel cable wrapped in a hose covered in duct tape. This is not what it seems like on TV. And then when I did the bump thing, I was like, oh, if you don't land really the right way and distribute your weight, like you can get knocked silly. So, and I wasn't doing anything. I was just taking back bumps. I was like, okay, this is enough. I can tell my audience, like, never even consider don't even come into the universe of the word fake with this stuff, because it's so real how hard it is.
Running a rope that seems like one of the most simple things in the world. I've seen 2-3-time All-American athletes run those rope for the first time, and it's comical to watch them run the rope. And then after they get it and they run it and they hit it the right way, then all of a sudden they're grabbing underneath 2 or 3 minutes later, hours later, they're coming up to look under, they're black and blue under there. I mean, it's brutal. I mean, without even taking a bump, all you got to do to convince yourself this isn't easy is run those damn ropes 1 or 2 times. You learn, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
And you know what's amazing about it, Jerry, is, the first time you run the ropes, and this is the crazy thing about the human body, is first time you run the ropes, it hurts like crap. I've seen guys break ribs, running the ropes the first time, it's so tough. But then even when you take a break for a year or two after you've been wrestling a while and you go back to running the ropes, it never hurts like it did the first time.
Yeah, right.
Your body has somehow either adapted or you're just desensitized to it. I don't know what it is. It's just amazing how the body adapts to it. I think that's why people disassociate violence from what we do a lot of times, because they see a big bump and they think, oh, there's nothing to that. The ring must be soft or something else. No, it's just guys have become very hardened, as they say in the fighting business, to landing and taking incredible falls.
It's like your whole body becomes one giant callus.
Yeah,
that's right.
You can take a bump and knock every breath of air in your body out of you by just taking a little simple bump. Sometimes, if you just twist just a little bit the wrong way, you probably experience that, Brad. You take a bump, you're gasping for air. Holy shit, what did I just do to my body? It's brutal just doing the basic things.
You don't realize like how much tucking your shin, right? Like if you don't tuck, you're gonna hit the back of your head. That's really bad.
Yeah, yeah, and you know, guys do it so many different ways, but it's an amazing thing to see guys when they first take the bumps. You know, it's like, oh my god, this really hurts, which it does. You know, but I don't know what it is. The body does get used to it. It's
Body
just
gets you. So what did you do? One day decided this is enough. I know how it feels now. I'm gonna write now.
Yeah,
Or
well,
was
I
it
was
the
I
other?
was on the road, so I didn't have the opportunity. But even if I had, I would have probably been like, you know what, guys, like,
you
my
learned
hats
enough.
my hats off to you. I'll do the writing, you do the wrestling.
Yeah, yeah.
Hey, Brad, we had a couple guys on. I know we're chasing rabbits. This is one of your chapters. We had John Langmead on, Steve Johnson on, who
Oh, nice. Yeah.
great wrestling historians who write a lot about professional wrestling from the can days to the professional wrestling days. From 1880 to specifically to up to the Second World War. Before television. You did a lot of research as well. What was your take on, say, some of the history of what were the biggest takeaways you got from it?
Well, I'd say that, I mean, and those guys, those are the real wrestling writers. Those guys have really done great work in the history. In terms of I think what happened right in the early 20th century is basically promoters realized that this was something that because so much about sports was gambling. I mean, it still is, but it was all about betting, and wrestling was something you could fix because you just had two guys and a referee. And they realized that the real shoot matches were lasting 8 hours, and no one wants to watch that. So like, hey, like this could develop into this entertainment form and be a lot more compelling for the audience. And so, by the 30s, it was pretty much a work. Although obviously the promoters weren't admitting that, but even I think at the point, the general public was aware that okay, this is change from what it used to be. Um, so yeah, it's got a fascinating origin, sort of gradually becoming from a shoot to a work.
Yeah, and I think that's where people got the idea that shooters don't draw money. Because I mean,
Yeah.
you heard that, Jerry. I know you heard that a bunch. They probably didn't say it
Oh,
to
I
you
used to
for a
get
joke.
I used to get fights over it. I mean, come on. I mean,
But
even Pat Patterson, as close as I were Pat, I mean, I'd get an argument. Pat, where you would be talking about something. We come a Dick Hutton or something like that, Del Lewis. Well, the shooters don't draw money. I said, wait a minute, Pat. I said,
yeah, tell that to Jim Londos. Tell that to Kurt
yeah,
Angle or Brock
yeah,
Lesnar.
yeah.
And I think they got that from the early days of the business.
They did exactly, yeah.
Because shooting, as they did it back then, didn't draw money, but
Right.
not the shooters, because the shooters were the ones that still drew the money. And
Yeah.
I mean, UFC's figured out how to make a shoot entertaining, and they're one of the most profitable companies in the world. But back then, when you had this 4 or 5 hour match, I think that's where people came across the idea shooters don't draw money. You got to have sports entertainment. But it's not the shooters, it's the way you were doing the shooting back then.
Yeah,
Once you get it, go down to the booker.
That's right. That's right.
and even until mid 80s, I mean, pro wrestling still had a very much of a more of a shoot orientation, in that it was more reality based. I think until Vince really started changing it in the mid 80s.
Yeah, and you saw that all through wrestling. You saw that with Gus Sonnenberg in the late 20s, when he came along and all of a sudden did the high flying. He was selling out arenas during the Depression, and people hated it. You think about the same thing they say about kids today, they're saying about Gus Sonnenberg then. And they're going, oh, funniest story I have is Jim Londos was this great shooter, maybe the greatest draw of all time in wrestling. Everybody talks about how he was such a serious wrestler. He used the airplane spin for a finish. That's the most hokey thing there is. So it's just, to me, it's people want to be entertained. It is the way that I always thought it. So let's go to the moment where you got Sheik, because the Sheik is such an interesting character, and he's threatened to kill you. Why did he threaten to kill you?
Okay, so this is a good story, that a good example of the mental state that he was in at this time, which was not good. I was in his living room,
and what year was this?
2005. So what I didn't appreciate at the time, that I now see much more in retrospect, is really just how hard, obviously, his oldest daughter's murder was. And that was in 2003. So not that long before, right? He was already in rough shape from the drugs and everything. And by the time 2003 rolled around. But then when his daughter Marissa got killed, that was just, unthinkable, horrible, and that really put him into a deep depression, and I think the addiction got worse. So it was only a couple of years after that, and we're in his living room, and again at this point, I mean, Sheik would launch into promos in his living room in front of nobody, right? Like, I mean, he would just start going like slapping his, like 6 years nobody beat Bob Backlund, and he would just go on these, and I'm like, Sheik, like, it's just me and you, like, who are you trying to, and he was just in his zone. And so he was saying something like, I'm the only Middle Easterner to come to your country and become a champion. And I was like, because I mean, hey, I was a fact checker. That's when I got my training in journalism. I said, well, actually, cause there was also Adnan Al-Kaisi, who was from Iraq, and never fact check an Iranian with an Iraqi, right? Because that was the worst possible thing to say. So his whole face turned beet red, and what the fuck, and just, that's when he threatened to kill me. Why don't you put me over? I'm the champion. And so he just didn't like that but I think also, I think Kaz never liked the Colonel Mustafa gimmick, which was always really strange to me that Vince did that, right? It's like, I don't know if you guys remember, but when they did the Gulf War angle with Slaughter, and when they brought him back, rather than having him be Iron Sheik, he called him Colonel Mustafa and put him in an Iraqi uniform. And it was just bizarre because everyone knew it was the Iron Sheik. And I think, again, like it was, the issues between Iran and Iraq, that was all a shoot. And I don't think he was very comfortable playing the Iraqi now.
Right, because you grow up hating the other. That's your rival. That is your single biggest rival.
Right.
Be like Mr. Brisco playing a Texan, which he should, because he's
because that'd be a great Texan. So anyway, which method did you choose?
Yeah, well, which did you choose to die from?
I chose the
Now wait a minute. How did he offer it to you? Was he thinking it to himself, or did he offer to you the choice to how to die?
Oh no, he said, like, just like I said, do you want me to shoot you with my 38 Magnum? I'll do this or that. And I think I was never as scared as I could have been, because I knew I could outrun him at that point, right? Like, and I think I just laughed. I mean, I was like, I'm gonna go back. I'm leaving, cause like this is not good.
I didn't come here to die today.
Yeah. So I mean, he calmed down. I mean, he would get in these. I mean, that was the drug. I mean, he would just fly off the handle, and then he would pull back and apologize, or he'd calm down. But at a certain point there, I realized, okay, this isn't going to work. I can't. This guy's not stable enough to work with me on this. And so I left and went on with my life, and went on and got my PhD and started writing books about baseball and all this other stuff. And then
what stage are you writing a book about Sheik at this point here? Was you in the process of writing, or
no? I mean, I had just written a proposal, and we were going to go out for a publisher. But meanwhile, I'd already quit my job, so I couldn't go back to my magazine job. So I had a pretty shitty year before I went to grad school and went on and get my PhD and went into science and all of that. And then years later, when I got back into the writing and the baseball book did well, I said, you know what? Like, I had heard that the Iron Sheik had cleaned up, and I said, okay, if he's sober, this is doable. But I said, no, I'm not. I want to do something bigger than just him. I want to write about like wrestling more generally and that era. So I chose that card where he won the belt to be like the focal point.
Now, well, you said you were living next to him. Did you move next to him for the book? Is that what you did?
Yeah.
So you literally had upended your whole life, moved next to the Sheik, and then all of a sudden he'd ask you how you want to die.
Can you imagine my girlfriend's reaction when I came home one day and I was like, I think I'm going to go move across the country to live next to the Iron Sheik. And she didn't even break up with me over that. I mean, it was crazy. But I really did. I mean, that's the kind of thing I think when you're in your early 20s and you're just too dumb to know better, right? Like, yeah, okay, I'll go do this.
Hey, why did you choose this card to write the book on?
Well, because I wanted the Sheik to be a focal point, and obviously that's kind of the the highlight of his career, winning the belt. And it's also the pivot point where wrestling history changes because of Hulkamania and the expansion and all that. And so I thought I could tell a little bit of that story while also telling the stories of several of the wrestlers.
You know, something that was very interesting during that time, the night we've had this with Mr. Brisco and I a few times with different guests. The 1983 Super Clash with Crockett, there were either 12 or 13 WWE Hall of Famers on it. So when you talk about this was a very pivotal time with Hulkamania and wrestling, it was it was everywhere.
Yeah.
So Vince saw this great card and realized that was better than what he had, and he basically poached the entire roster.
Yeah.
And because most of those guys were in WrestleMania 1.
Right. And then we get the
WrestleMania 3, rather.
WrestleMania story, the origin of WrestleMania. So I had a funny story. I interviewed Jean Scott, who was the widow of George Scott.
Jean well.
Yeah, and she was great, and she was there, right? And George is another name that's underappreciated in that era because so Vince buys the company, Vince goes national, but then Vince needs a booker, and Pat Patterson was still kind of still wrestling, so he brings George Scott in and Jim Barnett, but I think Jim was, Jerry, you correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Jim was more the office operations, and George was actually booking matches.
That's correct, and just to add a little point to that too. After we signed the papers and again received the check from Vince McMahon, payment in full for stock, he said, "I need a booker. Who do you recommend?" Jack and I both said George Scott.
Okay.
We called George Scott from the attorney's office, and we called Gordon Soley, which Gordon Soley denied, but we called him. But we called George first to find out if he'd be the booker, so we could tell Gordon that we got a booker. And George took Vince up on the offer, and Gordon said, "No, I'm gonna be loyal to NWA and stay here." But yeah, we called Vince from the attorney's office right after we signed the papers.
Right. Well,
that's how George got.
There you go. So that I just learned something new. The actual origin story of George Scott as the booker. So he comes in '84, and he's there till like middle of '86. And from what Gene told me, I mean, Vince apparently loved George, and George, they had a good relationship. Yeah. George, from what Gene told me, he had some issues with like the cartoonish direction of WWF.
True.
And that's why he left, according to Gene. But I guess they were sitting around a production meeting. This would have been in probably in Greenwich, the Greenwich, Connecticut office in early or late '84. And apparently Ed Cohen's there, and Vince, and Jim Troy, and George Scott, Howard Finkel. And a lot of people have said over the years that it was Howard that came up with the name WrestleMania. But based on all the people I interviewed, it was this obscure marketing guy named Rex Jones that actually came up with the name. But before that, Vince apparently wanted to call it the Colossal Tossle. And George laughed him out of the room. And, I guess
heard that, yeah.
George said, that is like the dumbest. And I don't think, again, from what I've never met, I met Vince very briefly, but I've never interviewed him. And from what I can tell, he didn't love being kind of shown up. But George apparently was one of the guys that could talk to Vince like that. And so, they kind of, okay, that's not going to work, Vince. But think about it, Vince had his way. We would be talking about the Colossal Tossle.
Had you heard that, Jerry?
I'd heard it. Yeah, I heard it. Not exactly put that way, but I heard that was the original name what Vince come up with.
That's awful.
Yeah, it's awful. It's horrible.
And what's funny about it is, Brad, you're right. If it'd been anybody but somebody that Vince loved and trusted, he'd have stuck with it if you laughed at him, just to show you that he could do it.
Right. Yeah. Right. So then of course WrestleMania comes shortly after that, and that's now we're getting, and then we get Saturday night's main event and Dick Ebersol, and then the whole thing is really taking off.
And this card, what this is 1983, right? The card that
right? December 26, 83. So unfortunately, a lot of the guys passed away from that card, but the guys that in the book are Tony Atlas, Jose Luis Rivera, Iron Sheik, Sergeant Slaughter, Tito Santana. And then I tracked down Hogan and Vince and who am I forgetting? Bill Eadie, the Mass Superstar.
Really? Yeah. Okay, take us to Orange Sheik. I mean, here you are, a young innocent boy from Providence, Rhode Island, and you're meeting Tony Atlas. I mean, Tony has a unique personality. What was your interview with Tony Atlas like, and getting into some of his well-known habits?
Well, I mean, I got to say, Tony to me was the most generous and forthcoming with his time.
As he is as a person.
Yeah, I mean, I went up to Auburn, Lewiston, Maine, where he's been for over 30 years, and it was amazing. He took me around to the YMCA where he still trains. I got to meet his wife, who's in an assisted living or a nursing facility up there, a nursing home facility, and kind of got. I mean, again, I really in the book I try to get at who these guys are away from the camera, and so I really appreciated that Tony was very honest about just how hard his early life was and some of the crazy stuff that he went through. Going to an orphanage when he was about 11. Some of the stuff that happened to him down in the South in the early years. I mean, it was pretty rough. And so that's and he didn't.
He was literally, a lot of people don't believe this story, but he was literally living on the streets, correct?
Yeah, up in Maine. Yeah, he was doing crack and eating out of dumpsters and living on a bench in the park. And so to have come back from that, it's a great comeback story. So we get into a lot of that in the story. He talked a lot about those issues, but an incredibly talented, charismatic, open guy.
Yeah, you look at some of the physical talent of some of those guys. Atlas was a 600-pound bencher back when now 600 pounds when you're doing it raw without the silly lifting shirts is still a world-class lift. Back then it was, there were very few people in the world that could do that. Yeah. And he had those, God, the arms he had it was ridiculous how big he was. And then you had the Sheik with the freaking Persian meals. That is still, have you seen Sheik do them? Did Sheik ever do them when you were there?
By that time he was doing like the small, not the full, the smaller ones. I don't think at that stage he really couldn't do them, but he's actually, when I saw him in 2022 and I peeked in his bedroom and those original clubs were still standing there, right by the bed.
I saw Henry Godwin, who could bench press about 4,000 pounds, try him one time in the garden. He snuck in there, with nobody looking, trying to get him. Unless you know how to do them, even all your strength in the world, you got to be super strong, but you got to know how to do them too. But it's amazing how hard those things were. I mean, that was really world-class what Sheik would do.
Yeah, those and the technique, and what people don't realize is those clubs and the pants. If you go to Iran, there's these houses of strength that are called Zorkhanes, and everybody in the Zorkhane does that at the same time. So it's one of their exercises, right? They're all wearing those same kind of colorful pants, and they're all doing the clubs.
It's fun looking up some of the old strength things that like the Great Gama. The stuff that he used to do and how Inoki and Gotch used to train. I mean, there's just some Farmer Burns did the same thing. He was famous for being able to hang himself because his neck was so big.
Wow.
I mean, these guys were just different levels. I'm just no stronger than the guys are today or anything else. Strength is strength, but it's just a different kind of strength and the different way they trained back then. It was really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely.
And Sheik was one of those great throwbacks. What's one of the most thing that surprised you most, or what was a commonality of visiting all these guys who were on this card that was so famous so many years ago?
I think there was a cost that came with all this, right? Like, I mean, I saw there was a certain just that road schedule in the late 80s was just unreal, right?
100 days in a row without blinking.
Yeah, and so I think that a lot of the guys, like Bill Eadie talked a lot about this, that he was one of the guys that.
How did you find Bill? Bill's a highly intelligent person, and he's kind of kind of strange for a business to be so analytical like he is and be such a great success in our business also.
Yeah, and right. I mean, Bill, he is a really thoughtful guy, really intelligent guy, and I think he's one of the only guys that from that era that stood up to Vince and refused to be pushed around in the sense that he sued him in right after he got so Vince had told him that he was going to make him an agent after the Survivor Series in 1990 and made all these promises. And Bill, when I was talking to Bill, I mean, he got emotional just talking about how his mantra is that your word matters so much, right? He really, he said, my dad taught me you have to live up to your word. And he really felt that Vince did not live up to his word when it came to what he promised him after his career was over, after his in-ring career was done. And so Bill was really hurt by that. And within less than a year of leaving the company, he sued Vince for basically saying, like, you underpaid us in all these events, because remember that when pay-per-view started, you have a pay-per-view show, right? And maybe you have a big house, and so you get a bigger check that night. But Vince didn't give anyone any of the pay-per-view revenue. So he was figuring in, like, okay, I'll give you a bigger payoff because it's a bigger show. But the actual pay-per-view gates or revenues were not really worked in there, unless maybe like for the top guy it was. But for someone like Bill Eadie, in his lawsuit, he said, look at all these shows where I only got paid this much and you were making this much, right? So I want this, he had a whole thing. And where a lot of people have sued Vince over the years, and most people either have it thrown out or they quit and they give it up. Bill went to court for 10 years, refusing to give in to Vince and fighting. And Bill told me, it's like at some point it wasn't even about the actual money. It was about the principle of not giving into this. And sure enough, he settled eventually. And I said, Bill, like, I know you can't tell me legally how much you settled for, but were you happy with the settlement? And he said, absolutely. So I know that Bill did pretty well. And then he got into the whole CTE discussion and the lawsuit there that he was a part of. So I think Bill is somebody that has thought a lot about, how wrestlers were compensated and what they sacrificed, and was very, forthcoming about that.
Did Bill win the lawsuit, or did Vince just settle it because it was a pain?
Yeah, no, he didn't. They didn't go to trial. He settled it, but for an amount that Bill was happy with.
Right. And the reason I ask that is, it seems it's so arbitrary, the payment. I mean, Jerry would know this much better than I would, because he did a lot with the payroll. But if you say you're worth $1,000, I mean, it's hard to argue that, hey, I'm worth 10,000 when the owner of the company says, no, you're worth 1,000. You know what I'm saying? I mean, it seems like you don't have a right.
So arbitrary on what your value is.
Right. And it seems like, go ahead.
No, I think that when all of these lawsuits, you're putting a number on something that's not objective, right? There's some arbitrary nature of that. I think what Bill was saying was, like, he wanted more transparency around the formula that's used, or some kind of, like, why is it that this is the way it is? And again,
in those days, I could tell you there were no formulas because you couldn't have one. And each show was different, of course, so it was different. So, but you got to respect Bill and Bill's always been an upright, stand-up man. I always believe he's very, very intelligent for this business, and so I got a lot of respect hearing that story, because I really didn't know the whole story about that lawsuit. But I knew about the CAT because I was more involved at that time. Yeah, Bill. Another guy that's in the chapter that I want to touch on because of the involvement with another character there was Jose Rivera. I mean, what a good guy he was. He went to Puerto Rico. Tell us his story.
Yeah, I know. So you could probably edit this out, but I do have a thing at 3:30 that I have to go to for my time. Yep. So I'm happy to come back.
Yeah.
But I can answer it. So so Jose Luis Rivera is yeah. I really wanted to write about a guy that was not a top guy, and Jose was a guy that was consistently in the mix, right? And
Always, yeah.
really good worker, a good hand from everyone's account.
He was one of those guys that Vince kept around because of that. Vince kept a lot of guys around because of their work rate and work ethic.
And then I think the most interesting story about Jose was that I don't think he'd ever shared before publicly was that he actually got a little push around that time in '83, and they were telling him, Vince Senior, who's still alive, told him, "We're going to give you a push because we need a new Pedro. We need a Latin American Latino star," and so he started to get a little push, and then all of a sudden it disappeared, and he went to, I don't know who was, Pat Patterson or someone in the office, and he said, what's going on?" And what he was told was that Jose Gonzalez, who was there as one of the invaders, had basically gone and squashed he'd gone to the office and said, "This guy's not ready. Don't give him the spot." And of course, we know later on the whole Bruiser Brody thing, and so
Right.
there was always some controversy that followed that guy around, and so Jose was, understandably disappointed that's what happened.
Yeah, exactly.
Hey, Brad, I know you got to run because you got another appointment. I cannot get enough of the Vince McMahon 79 to 83.
Yeah.
So we would love to have you back on because I want to talk so much about this Cape Cod. I know he put up the Harlem Globetrotters. I mean, there was so much going on during this time. I always
Evil Knievel, even, John. Don't forget Evil Knievel.
That's right. That's right. There was so much in this that I thought laid the foundation for what Vince became. That run in Cape Cod. But your book Six Pack is just fantastic, and I can't thank you enough for coming on and sharing the stories with us. So much about the Iron Sheik. I'm glad you chose D, none of the above, because if you chose broken leg, we wouldn't have known because you just had like a broken leg there, and I don't think you would have died.
No, hey, it's great chatting with you guys again. Like, one of the things, my takeaways from this whole book is like I have a lot of respect for the people that do this for a living. So, great work you guys have done in your careers, and it's been fun to chat.
Thank you.
Thank you. The book, of course, is still out on Amazon and all this different stuff. The book's name is Six Pack. This is Brad Balukjian.
You got it.
That's right. Thanks. Hey, Brad, thank you very much.
All right. Thanks, guys.